Introduce Dr. Fred Fountain.
Good evening. I better see if that's written down. Good evening. Good evening and welcome to all of you, to everyone. Bonsoir et bienvenue à tous ce soir. It's a delight to have you here. Thank you for being here. As Adrian said, I'm Fred Fountain, and I and my wife Elizabeth and our daughter Catherine established the Alex Fountain Memorial Lecture here at King's. And I also want to say welcome and good evening to those of you who are seeing this on the video screen in the room upstairs, which I just checked, which is virtually full. And also those of you who are watching live on the website and on the Facebook page stream, as I understand it. And so welcome to you all. And if Catherine, you're watching in Montreal, hello, sweetheart. she would have loved to have been here. We would have loved to have her here, but she, as our guest speaker will appreciate it, McGill are quite demanding, and she has a heavy academic schedule this week. So I want to tell you very briefly why we established this lecture series and what it's about, and very briefly a word or two about Alex before we move on to the exciting presentation that we're going to have this evening. And I feel very upbeat and excited about that, and we're very privileged to have Charles Taylor here. You'll hear more about him very shortly. Elizabeth and I created this lecture series, and Catherine, with the great help of Bill Barker and Adrian Abbott here at King's College. Last year was the first of an annual event, and we did it because, as many of you would know, maybe most of you don't, but Alex was a student at King's College here in his last year at, he would have been in class in 2010, and he died in late 2009. And he received his degree posthumously. And parenthetically, I might also add that we're very proud that Elizabeth received an honorary degree this year from King's College. She's the real Dr. Fountain. So Alex was all about inclusiveness. Many of you who knew him will know that. We wanted to do something at King's that would be inclusive and expressly designed for students, for you. Many of you, most of you here are students and are there. And we wanted to do something really for students, something which would be open to all, but open, especially inviting the students and as many as, excuse me, as many as possible who could take advantage of it or wanted to take advantage of it. So we decided a lecture series would be a good thing to endow and to set up on an annual basis. We could try and have somebody very exciting to come. But we also decided that this should be a student choice lecture series. The student should have a say in who they'd like to hear lecture. And consequently, it was determined that the students could, all you students, could put in a name, anybody in the world that you might want to hear, and with no limitations on the subject matter, theme. So that's what it is. And so there's a process whereby the names are submitted by students, and top of the list is chosen, and hopefully is willing and able to come. So that's how we got here. Alex Fountain. I'm going to say this, and a lot of you who know him will back me up on this. Alex was a sweetheart. He was a very friendly, inclusive, engaging, witty, smart, likable young man, and unselfish, funny, usually a big, engaging smile on his face. Very talented. He was an A student. He loved King's. It was his first choice of the university. He loved being here. His ambition was to be a teacher. I think he would have been a good one. And he was full of intellectual curiosity, an A student. He had many, many friends. He was very, very active in the Halifax music community, and active in the Halifax pop explosion, and we had a very close, loving family. Sort of a young fellow who you think pretty much has everything going for him. Somehow along the line, in the latter part of his last year or so of his life, he came down with heavy-duty depression, and he took his own life. And that shocks me to this day to say that. But and I just want to mention that we can't afford to lose people like that, and certainly in our family we can't, but nobody can. We need people like him. And I just want to make a point that in many ways Elizabeth and I and Catherine are trying to do things to help people with mental health issues. But I want to say to people who are suffering maybe from depression or from anxiety disorders or mood disorders that don't be afraid to speak to somebody. Ask somebody help. Speak to somebody you trust, and you will get help. It may not be instant overnight, but you will get help. And there are lots of people who care, who want to do something, who are trying to do something. So I'll make that comment to you. Now, I'm just about ready to turn this over, and I want to say that, although it brings me down to say that we have a great memory of Alex, and we have a great institution here, and we're very special. And this is a special event, I think. We have a very special speaker tonight. So we're fortunate that we have what I would call one of the world's great thinkers here with us tonight, who not only is one of the world's great thinkers, but who has a very generous and down-to-earth spirit of conveying his thoughts to people. And that's something that may be a bit rare. And so we're very fortunate to have him here. And before I'm going to ask someone else to give an introduction, but I would just say that I think it's somewhat fitting that we're able to say that on the subject of democracy and its possible decline or dangerousness, we're very fortunate to be able to have the backdrop tonight that our neighboring country to the south has put on a demonstration election for us. I'm sure we'll all check that out before midnight. So I'm going to ask Nick Sparks, the president of the Student Council, to introduce our speaker.
Thank you, Dr. Fountain, for your generosity, and we're really honored to be able to keep the memory of Alex alive tonight. And we'd like to thank you very much for making our discussion tonight possible. There could be neither a more fitting time nor a finer figure to ask the question that concerns us now: is democracy in danger? And as Dr. Fountain said, at the close of the US election, and at the time when the gulf between the rich and poor has never been more vast, and our own countries facing challenges posed by a shifting cultural identity, it is a question we do well to ask now. And we're fortunate to seek an answer from one of Canada's most profound political thinkers. Dr. Charles Taylor has spent his life examining the social, religious, and political dimensions of modernity. Studying in Oxford under Isaiah Berlin and G.E.M. Anscombe, Dr. Taylor is a fellow of All Souls College and professor emeritus of political science and philosophy at McGill University. In recognition for his contributions to political and philosophical thought, Dr. Taylor was made a Companion of the Order of Canada in 1995, and in 2007 received the prestigious Templeton Prize for progress toward research or discoveries about spiritual realities. Perhaps equally prestigious for us, he is also the subject of an upcoming book about Canadian Hegelianism to be edited by our very own Drs. Robertson and Dodd. Dr. Taylor has been an active member of Canadian and Quebecois society since the 1950s, and he's identified Islamophobia and cultural differences as the greatest challenges facing contemporary Canada, But what of our southern neighbors? And what of liberal societies the world over? Is democracy in danger? To find out, please welcome Dr. Charles Taylor.
Thank you very much. Thank you for that very fine introduction. Can people hear in the back? This is supposed to work perfectly, yes. If you don't hear, say, I think that, and I want to thank also Fred and Elizabeth Fountain for their tremendously generous and very courageous and very moving initiative here in putting forward this lecture series. And I hope that we can really discuss these issues in the spirit that I capture of Alex Fountain and his. He seems to be someone we really need in our democracies, and we'll see more why. I'll try to explain more why that's the case when we look into this. Okay, so democracy in danger, a little bit maybe dramatization, but they put me up to it. I gave it double. But yes. A few words at the beginning, though, about what democracy is, because it's a very strange phenomenon. For one thing, it means power to the people, or sometimes it was defined in terms of sovereignty in the modern world. You know, we moved from the king being sovereign to the people being sovereign. That was the people or the nation being sovereign. That was the language of the French Revolution. But what immediately strikes you is that the word sovereign doesn't have quite the same meaning when you have a monarch, it's attributed to, when you have a people. When you have a single ruler, there's never very much doubt about who's in charge. I mean, if you're in Russia, you know that Putin is in charge, or you better find out quick. But the people being sovereign, well, that can only happen via a complex process, and people work out a complex process. I mean, constitutionally, electing people to a parliament, and then they're electing a prime minister, or complex things in the south, which is so complex I won't go into it now. There needs a procedure, and it has to be a procedure that people can relate to, that they can understand and can see as a valid procedure. And that immediately puts you into the realm of cultural difference, because in very different societies, there's very different understandings of what a good procedure would be. When you think of, that's the problem with this idea of let's introduce democracy everywhere. It's not always easy or obvious. Something like Afghanistan, for instance, it was a traditional procedure, the Loya Jirga, where people got together who were representing the various regions, I mean, the various really powerful sort of top men in the various regions, and they negotiated. That was an understood traditional idea of what it was to get everyone together and make a decision. But we would find that totally unacceptable, and in other societies, it just wouldn't make any sense. And you can get moments in history when democracy fails to get off the ground because there isn't an agreed, understood procedure. The French Revolution is an excellent case of that. After they got rid of the king, it wasn't clear exactly what institutions would really convey the will of the people. Was it the National Assembly? Was it, on the contrary, the people themselves who sometimes erupted into the National Assembly and demanded change and so on? It took a long time to work that out. So democracy requires some set of rules, procedures, way of operating is seen as and trusted as expressing the will of the people. And that's where the big problem arises, because it's not transparent and evident, because there's a complex procedure. It's always possible to doubt whether it's really working as it's supposed to be working, whether it's really delivering, whatever the elections or structure is it really delivering the popular will? So there is this gnawing doubt in democracies. Now, That's what I want to get into. I want to get into a big, big problem of democracy. It's not the only one. At the end, I want to put it together with others, but I want to go at length on this one because I think it's very important and it's not on the center of the screen. And that is this very issue of, well, what represents really the will of the people? Now, democracies require, as I said, a procedure, some idea of what it means to express the will of the people. But democracies have a huge problem that they face. They need a procedure which can contain conflict. Why do they need conflict? Well, there are smaller societies that don't, I mean, very small. The Swiss cantons we all dream of, maybe they weren't like this, but everyone got together, and all the men and women weren't there, but they raised their swords and so on. Maybe they didn't have to have conflict. But very large-scale societies, like this one, one to the south, the modern nations that we know, they can't live without conflict because there are big differences, and the differences have to be thrashed out. And not only conflict, but they require standing parties or movements and so on, which are different from each other and which are working it out. So not just a conflict about this today and a conflict about that tomorrow, which could happen in a small committee at any time, but standing groups that have a certain philosophy, a certain approach. They change over time, but they're basically standing for a long time. This kind of endemic conflict. And yet, it's easy to have conflict and to have a civil war. That is the great secret of democracy, that we can have a conflict without civil war. That some can win, some can lose, but everyone can feel that we're committed to the result, that we all belong together. So there has to be this very powerful sense of unity, sense of belonging to a people, belonging to a nation, and which has its own dangers. I'll come to that in a minute. But the main point I want to make now is that democracies don't work without conflict. The alternative to conflict, a really smooth running democracy without conflict, would be a society which in a very important sense wasn't really a democracy, because it would be run by people who have the bases of more power. And there is in every society people, it may be birth in the ancien regime and the aristocracy, it may be being big landowners, it may be being owners or managers of big corporations, very, very different things. But there are always people that are closer to the levers of power than others. And if there is no pushback against this, you slide towards a kind of elite rule. Now, if you look at the history of modern democracy, and this is one of the central messages I'd like to make, history of modern democracy, let's look at the States, for instance, in the 19th century. You have one kind of situation of elite versus the rest in the early 19th century. You have the Federalists, who were really people of means and were the leaders in the time of the Revolution, and then you have a pushback by what were then called the Democrats. I guess they're still called the Democrats, but they were called Republicans for a while, which is very confusing if you read American history, but they became quickly called the Democrats. They elected Jackson in the 1820s, and you have this kind of expression of the popular will against certain of the powerful interests. But then, the whole situation changed. The sociology and the economics of the American system changes. When you get to the end of the century, there are so-called robber barons, very powerful owners of industry that were riding roughshod over the rights of labor and more or less ran the society. So from a relatively democratic way of expressing the will of the people, you get, on the contrary, a situation where some very powerful people have disproportionate influence. And then you work away at that, and development of trade union movements, development of the New Deal, and so on. And then the situation changes again, and we're in a world in which the economic situation, the cultural situation is constantly changing. So one of the basic points I want to make is that democracy is always something recurrent, not every moment. Recurrently, it's something to be remade. It seems to work, you get the structures that make it work very well, that make a real expression from the bottom up at time t, and then at time t plus x, the situation's changed, and we're in danger of sliding back. Now, when I talk about danger, that's the one I want to talk about today, because I think we have a case where we're now a little bit sliding back. It's almost like the Gilded Age with the robber barons, not quite as dramatic as that, but we're in danger of sliding back. And that's why the very word is very interesting here. We go back to the meaning of the word, demos. Demos, the people in Greek. Now, this is a very interesting word because it has in Greek a sense that its gains continue to have today, but there's also another sense we give it today, so it's a word which has two meanings. On one level, you can say the people is what? Everybody, all the members of the nation. On another level, if you go back to the Greek time, the people meant the non-elites. Not everybody, but the non-elites. When Aristotle talked about democracy, he talked about a rule by one of the classes, right? It was the rule by the common people, and they were riding roughshod over the interests of the patricians, you might call them. And on the other side, you had oligarchy, was the opposite, of the rule by the patricians over the demos. And that sense of democracy as a rule simply by the people against the interests of the elites is something which the word retained right up until the threshold of the democratic era. When the American founders talked about democracy, they said, no, not for democracy. They were thinking the Greek way of applying this word. So they said we have a republican constitution, not a democratic one. Then we kind of shifted in our use of the word, and now it's something that everybody is for. Right? But it retains this kind of double meaning. Why the double meaning? Well, because in order for democracy to be real, there has to be this powerful component, this powerful input from people who are not members of one another, who don't have obvious sources of power as exceptional sources of power. And so in that sense, it's a kind of balance in the term, and that reflects what I'm talking about. A democratic society is a society in conflict, and yet which manages to come together beyond the conflict, make decisions that are really accepted by everyone. Not liked, but accepted. This represents us. Okay, so my point is, and I want to now apply this to the last 50 years or so, my point is that democracy needs regularly to be remade. We never have it once and for all. We think we have it once and for all. And we think the world is becoming democratic, and we already are, and those poor pathetic people, they're going to become like us. We think that because we think it a sufficient condition of democracy that we have this constitutional structure that seems to be okay, right? And that stays the same. I mean, that can stay the same. We have pretty well the same structure of government since Confederation. The Americans had pretty well the same structure of government since the late 18th century. So that if that's democracy, then you get it, and you've got it, and you can relax. But that is not delivering the real goods of empowering, if you like, ordinary people, empowering non-ordinary people. And there we see another story, kind of snakes and ladders story, a little bit. Success at one time and the situation changes and it has to be recreated. Now let's quickly look at the situation, well, the last 60 years, I don't know how many years, but since the Second World War. So it was a period after the Second World War, about 30 years. In France, they always speak of les 30 glorieuses, the 30 glorious years, because there were 30 years of really extraordinary prosperity, growth, but they were also years of leveling up, of the creation of greater equality, of spreading prosperity through the whole society. I mean, partly through the creation of welfare states, partly through the maintenance of full employment, partly through a whole lot of other measures. And one striking thing about it, that era, was the widening of what you would call the middle class, right? To include lots and lots of people who formerly were thought of as working class because they began to get a kind of middle class, middle class style of life. Now, since about, let's say 1980, 1975, 1980, 45 to 75, that's the talk over years maybe. Then we have, whatever it is, 40 something, 35. Well, my math is very bad. Where anyway. But less glorious. As a matter of fact, we're moving backward. That is, if you look at the squeezing of the difference between the very rich and the very poor, the lessening of that difference which took place during that post-war period, we find the reverse happening now. And we're back in the sense in the Gilded Era of the robber barons in North America, at least in the United States, where the gap is widening again, in a way that's kind of frightening. Okay, so what has been happening here? Well, it's very, very complex. It's actually very complex because there are economic changes. You can think of economic changes, and you can think of cultural changes. I want to talk briefly about the economic changes because we all know them fairly well, and at greater length about the cultural changes because they're very interesting, and I don't know if we have still yet the right way of getting our minds around. The economic changes are, well, roughly to do with what people call globalization, or different facets of globalization. I mean, one facet of globalization has been the tremendous ability of capital to move all over the world. And so you get corporations that used to be sited in one society, making whatever it's cars or what have you, that now have part of the work done here, part of the work done there, part of the work done elsewhere. And that's one very important aspect of globalization. The other important aspect is the reduction of barriers of trade, therefore the much greater, wider movement of trade. Now these have very positive sides to these two changes, particularly the second, obviously, that we can, it's better for everyone, generally, provided distribution is right, it's better for everyone to have that kind of open trade, open frontiers. But it's had very bad side effects. One of the important side effects of the first change, the tremendous mobility of capital, has been to break down one of the pillars of this wider middle class, which was people in what people call the working class in the States, but who have steady jobs, some kind of pensions and benefits and so on. Now you have the reduction in the possibility of steady jobs, the reduction of part-time, the jobs, we call them in Quebec, little jobs and so on. We get a pressure on that, which is beginning to reverse not only the general leveling of income, but reverse also the widening of the middle class. And now we see the crisis, one crisis of the society, is the chipping away of that kind of middle class life. Okay, so it's and background, against the background of that change. There's been a change in what I want to call political culture. And this is more complex to explain. And I probably don't understand it very well myself, so I may be less coherent than I want to be. It's a change, I want to call it a change in how people understand political efficacy. Political efficacy is, I feel I have political efficacy when I feel I can do something great to affect the outcome. I feel I have no political efficacy when I think, well, what can I do? Nothing I can do is going to have an impact on this political process. Now, what was the model of political efficacy? Well, the model of political efficacy in the past, including those 30 voting years, but actually before that too, was the model in many, many societies, including this one, of very large-scale parties, not very many of them, maybe they were coalitions, which had different programs, slightly different philosophies, sometimes left and right. And so the idea was, I vote for one of them because I basically agree with the general program. So I'm going to vote for this party, and I'll have an effect on the ultimate outcome because I'm voting for the party that I mostly agree with on these issues. Now you get a really important change in the notion of political efficacy developing through the 70s. The 60s would really happen in the 70s, what we call the 60s and beyond. And you see there the development of people being into single important issues, not packages anymore. I mean, many people. Single important issues. Ecological issues. Feminist issues, equality of men. Gay liberation issues. Issues of, could be world government, issues of helping people in the developing world and so on. And people put a lot of energy into these issues. And they tended to feel somewhat dissatisfied with the big parties, partly because they were really powerful, either this and not necessarily that, partly because they felt the big parties were fudging their particular issues, right? So you even get, in the case of the ecological issue, you get parties breaking off, green parties break off in various countries and become parties on their own. Now, what's behind this? What's behind this is a lot of very, very interesting change, which is very hard to get your mind around. But it's something to do with this. There's new kinds, if you like, of individualism. The individualism that I want to call authenticity. People who are, asking themselves about their identity, asking themselves what's reading me, asking themselves what is fulfill me in my life, what do I have to give, what do I have to contribute. And these kind of issues encouraged a certain sense of finding out about myself. Now this was something in many ways very, very positive because it liberated all sorts of energies that had been trapped before. Or there were issues like feminist issues about equality, which again ran athwart very often the left and right difference. Very often the Socialist parties are just as bad, if not worse, in giving women place as the parties of the right, and vice versa. So you get this another issue people felt, and that was of course linked. These issues were linked to a sense of identity. What's my identity as a woman? Or the sexual revolution. The important parts of that. Think of the gay liberation side of the sexual revolution. It's very interesting because that's something that didn't exist in earlier decades. Someone like André Gide, as a homosexual, came out of the closet in the 1920s in France because he felt he owed it to people who were gay to do that. People didn't use the word gay, those people, to do that because he was thinking of the tremendous suffering that these people had and so on. But the gay liberation movement you see in the 1960s and 70s picked up on the notion of identity. Right? My identity is gay. And therefore made the issue of gay liberation a matter of equality and non-discrimination. So we eventually got a decision by the Canadian Supreme Court about this issue of gay marriage. Interesting enough, made on this question of equality. So issues of identity and equality, you see these were bursting up. There was a lot of good things here. Issues that were kept undercover by the old system of left and right were bursting up. So this is something very positive here. But into this, we were working together with these economic changes. It had negative consequences too. Because, well, partly because sometimes the search for identity was a little bit too bound up with modern consumerism, and the advertising industry already are nailed decline. Selling brands on the ground that this is my identity, Nikkei shoes, whatever it is, just do it and so on. So there was a kind of trivialization of the whole issue. But it also helped to feed this notion of individualism and breaking some links of solidarity. But also, let's look, we can go into this at great length, and I want to stop myself because I want to not go over too much over my time. But you can see this, however, working its way out in the way it affects the vote. It's not an accident that in this period of switch in our understanding of political efficacy, the level of participation in votes goes down in most Western democracies. We could see this if my energy is mainly into feminist issues or mainly into ecological issues. I'm going to be less keen on the idea I'm going to vote with this party and they're going to do everything that I want in that program. No, I'm going to be more hesitant about it. I'm going to put more energy into the movement pushing for this kind of change, it's a single issue movement. So the vote may go down. But then at the same time, partly because the vote is going down, the sense of efficacy connected to voting goes down, right? Because people begin to, to feel that this is not really yielding anything. And particularly when you think of the following situation, which I think is generally true, that when the vote starts declining in societies like ours, the decline is greater in certain media than others. The decline is greater among people who are poor than among people who are richer. The decline is greater among people who are less educated than among people who are more educated. The decline is often higher among minorities that don't really get educated than among the majority. So you get a kind of uneven incidence of this decline in vote, which tends to disempower those who are not in the positions from the beginning, which are more likely to be powerful in society. Here I want to make a footnote, a parenthesis. I mean, forget not waste a few minutes in parenthesis, because it's absolutely fascinating. And it takes us out of our world, and we see how different democracy is. I mean, I've just said to you that the vote goes down more among poor than rich. And if you're a political scientist here and you were asked the question, who votes a higher percentage, the rich or the poor, I'm sure you would say it's not even worth doing the numbers again. We just know that the rich do vote more. But in India, it's reversed. Indian political scientists show that people in the lower caste vote more than the upper caste. People in rich and poorer parts of the society vote more than rich. Very often women vote more than men. And that has something to do with the sense that a lot of Indians in lower caste, non-elite positions, let's say, have, that democracy, Indian democracy, is a mechanism, a procedure, which can actually promote their status, their interests, that something can actually be done with this. And this gives me another point that I wanted to make, and I want to have in the background of our thinking, that there's all sorts of issues in democracy, but sometimes the big issue in democracy itself, is how to make democracy more real. And when you get societies in the process of making democracy more real, there's a vibrancy to it, real participation to it that you don't have elsewhere. And you saw that's what explains the Indian case. It explains phenomena like Tahrir Square, where you have this tremendous sense of you have to move forward and enthusiasm. In a way, it's bad news that democracy needs to be rebuilt all the time, but it's potentially also good news because the vibrancy of the democracy can be very much greater. Okay, so we have this situation where, unfortunately, the effect of these economic changes and the effect of these cultural changes together work towards a greater sense of disempowerment, because still the major method of empowering yourself in a democracy without procedures is to vote for someone who will do what you want to do as against what someone else wants to do. The vote goes down, and that partly reflects the interest in this and that issue being more important, but it also partly reflects the sense that the vote is less useful, not getting it. And we then get a kind of vicious spiral. You get a kind of vicious circle. That is, a sense of distrust in the system that is not really getting anywhere leads to less voting, which leads to further distrust in the system, which leads to less voting. Or, from another point of view, let's look at it from another point of view. When you get these mechanisms, organizations working for solidarity across huge groups of people on a general program, you can get a lot of turnout of the vote through those kinds of parties, organizations, and so on. You look at Obama in 2008. We'll see what happens to that. We'll come back to that perhaps in a minute. You can get a lot of people brought out because of that linking of a large solidarity. But if you don't have that, then the role of money becomes all the greater in society. I mean, principally because the major way of mobilizing vote is through television, convincing people through television. The cost of television is very high. If you also have a society where the influence of the very rich and powerful is such that they undercut the very possibility of expenses being limited and expenses being paid in large part by the public. And then you get, well now we're talking about, you know what we're talking about the neighbors to the south. Then you get these absolutely, to me, appalling Supreme Court decisions about considering it to be a First Amendment right that people in law and corporations can spend any amount of money. You know, these rights were meant for real flesh and blood human beings. These are the bearers of rights in our society, not faceless corporations. Or, for that matter, trade unions. I mean, any kind of collective body shouldn't have that same kind of rights. Anyway, with these decisions, you get the tremendous increase in the power of money. Well, then you see another kind of spiral. So you'll say, against that, what can you do to fight? Then you get the way in which money interacts with media and so on. And so you get a series of dangerous spirals moving us down. Now that's the danger. It's not the only problem. We're going to come to that. A few more. I'll put together at the end. But that is the danger. You can get on a slide. You can get on a slide where cynicism and disbelief in the actual democracy, its actual procedures, leads to people checking out of them, as it were, and that leads to even further disadvantages for those people, and so even further cynicism, and you can't beat the system, and so on. And so you can get a society sliding downward democratic. Well, now you get, there's several of these more vicious cycles where A feeds B, and that feeds A more, and that feeds B more. Distrust leads to greater inequality, greater distrust, greater inequality. But perhaps the most worrying of all of these spirals is the way that they undermine something which is absolutely fundamental to democracy, which is a sense of citizen equality. Now, there's an absolutely brilliant book by the French historian. I'm just going to put his name on the book. Which those of you who read French can read right away, but I guarantee you it's going to be translated somehow by Princeton. La Société des Égaux, the Society of Equals, which is an absolutely brilliant work on precisely what this ideal of citizen equality is from the very beginning in the Great Revolutions. It's not simply an issue of blood distribution. That touches it, it's not the center. What it is a kind of understanding, social imaginary, kind of understanding that we are together as equals. We form a collective agency as a people. We form a collective unit. But we are a collective unit of people that understand each other as being equals. There are all sorts of collective units, like families, there are feudal lords and their followers, there are armies where they operate very effectively as collective units where the orders come down to the general. But there is this very particular kind of sense of relation that we have as equal agents together. And that is one of the most precious and important things. That is itself a very basic value. That is itself something that feeds our sense that what we're doing is really important. It's the key democratic value. Now, there's always something a little bit fictitious to it, but it can get less fictitious and more fictitious. It's always, put it more kindly, it's always perhaps more an aspiration than a realized fact, but it can be farther nearer to that realized fact. If you get a society, if you spiral to the point where you can see that a lot of people, very rich, are living in gated communities, and a lot of very poor are in ghettos, how could they possibly imagine themselves as being equal citizens? I mean, it just doesn't make any more existential sense in their lives to see either of them as that. And what you get happening to deprive us of this very central democratic value is something very insidious. See, it's not that the people at the top as it were, reject the idea of citizen equality. Is that they develop various ideologies to the effect that other people aren't really living up to this. So you get, well, the best example is the 47% of the candidacy for the South, right? I mean, if you really think that 47% of the people are just not living up to the normal requirements of being a citizen of this great nation, self-reliant and so on, and just living off, well then, it's not possible to feel that they're, that you have got an obligation to be on this kind of footing with them. No, you're on this kind of footing with people that really are pulling their weight. Or what is it Governor Perry said? You know, some people are sitting on the wagon, other people are pushing the wagon. So it's this kind of somewhat contemptuous view of that is what breaks the very basic understanding of citizen equality. And that's what makes it possible to justify in a democratic society, which everybody at some level knows is based on this value of being citizens together. You can justify that neglecting big parts of the population. Now it's these kind of, so this is where we get, okay, I may be going off in too many directions at once, but I'll try to hold it together. This is where you get one of the really big viruses that can eat into a more democratic society, where people cease to recognize others as really their co-equal citizens in the meaning of the act. And this is a danger within democracy itself for two reasons. One, of course, there's a certain ideal attached to being an equal citizen. So you could always judge that these other people aren't living up to the ideal, right? They're not pulling their weight. For instance, there are cases where that's true. Somebody's practicing corruption and trying to buy their way into office, they're obviously not acting. But when these widespread ideologies look at whole classes of the population, from the outside, without understanding the kind of drama they're going through, and as we're put this ideological gloss on them, then you have very deep rifts. The second reason why these deep rifts keep happening is that, as I said earlier, in order to have a living democracy, you have to have the strong sense that we belong together in a single people and a single nation and so on, whatever the word is. And there the danger is that people that don't belong, as it were, culturally to the historical nation, etc., can be read out of the picture, which is what we see in many European societies today in relation to Muslims. Alas, in Quebec, we have this fight going on about the new inclusif or the new exclusive. You know, it doesn't feel. So these are the viruses that eat away at democracy, that eat away at our basic value of understanding ourselves as being equal citizens. And here we get another possible spiral. If that kind of sense of reading these people out becomes wide enough, then the practice deviates totally from accepting people as equal citizens, and then the sense that there is such a basic fact about us begins to wither on both sides. Right? People who are more deprived by this can't see these people as being colleagues in the same enterprise, and vice versa. No. So there are various ways in which this kind of inequality feeds on itself and begins a downward spiral. Now these are the dangers that I think we see in our democratic societies today, or a danger, a very powerful danger, which is the danger of like spiraling inequality. And we've let it go very, very far, I think, in our society. Since the Reagan-Thatcher era, we've let it go very, very far. We've had all sorts of ideological justifications of it and so on. The absolute, tremendously important truth that our society really depends on entrepreneurship, that people have to have the possibility of being entrepreneurs in order to create something new that's essential in our society. This is parlayed into by a series of slippages and into this kind of contempt for others who have as they see. They did, without really looking at the lives, if you look at the lives in detail of people that are very poor in our society, we sometimes find incredible resilience, incredible sense of what, deep realities, system, being able to make do with very, very little. But from the outside, it looks as though they aren't like that. So the very important value of free enterprise gets twisted into this other form, as you see happening again in that scene below the 45th parallel. Here's the 42nd parallel in Canada. So complex country, I never know quite where we are, but you see that happening. And there is this danger of the spiral feeding on itself. So, okay, what do we do about this? I was hoping no one would ask me that question. Well, I guess I've run out of time. No, I mean, just, yeah, it's very, very hard to see. I mean, what you need to do is find ways of harnessing what is very evidently a deep dissatisfaction in our societies about this, which you see in the Occupy movement, which you saw in the Quebec student movement, which you saw in Spain. You see it in many, many countries. But unfortunately, just having that dissatisfaction isn't enough. When journalists ask other people in the Occupy movement, Occupy Square in New York, well, you're going to vote for, no, vote. I mean, that's all corrupt, voting parties and all. I mean, that is cutting yourself off from the only vehicle of change. Not going to be any change if you just take that attitude. So all that energy has to be channeled into new forms of mobilization. We have to have new ways of consulting people, new ways of forming consensuses that can allow that to become part of the political debate, and then political parties that will take that up. And it's a tall order because there are, I just want to mention some other problems that these have to be taken up in connection with other really big challenges that are facing our democracy today. I mean, one that are not being really properly addressed. One is the tremendous challenge in some countries, in my province, particularly the States, of public debt. Nobody is really wanting to touch, or many people are not wanting to touch in those societies. One is the challenge of multiculturalism. There's the danger of sliding into exclusionary positions, which Canada as a whole is quite good on, I would say, but I mean, not totally good, and I'm worried about Quebec. And the third is perhaps the biggest thing of all, which is the dangers arising from global warming, which we're just letting go. And you have in the States that can't raise it anymore because the Republican Congress says it doesn't exist. So no, even though in science, we don't believe in science. And in our country, we have a government that has pretty well the same attitude. We're talking about federal Canada. And that's very frightening. So there has to be a way of addressing these really big issues that we all face. But address them in a way which brings back a real sense of input from non-elites in our society, which addresses the issue of equality. And it's not beyond human wit and understanding to devise a program. But it has to be done, and we have to be able to mobilize around it. Okay, how do we do that? I really have no idea. That's very, very hard. Now, I mean, obviously, I have my little suggestions for the Canadian scene, for someone who may be able to guess. But this is the problem faced by all Western democracies. So, what I was talking about then in this sliding towards inequality, it's not the only one. It's only one of our problems. But it is, I want to talk about it because it's a big problem and it's going to me under the radar. I mean, it's not going under the radar of people who turn out for Occupy, but it's going under the radar of public discussion. It's not really raised and it's not really recognized by lots of people. But it's the most dangerous thing for democracy because, on one hand, it can eat away at the very entrails of democracy, at our sense of common citizenship. On the other side, I want to reiterate what I said earlier. The most vibrant democracies are the ones where democracy is being reestablished, and we're moving towards it when people have a sense of moving in that direction, as in the case of India. Lots of things wrong with Indian democracy, but that's not one of them. So we have to face these big common problems in such a way as to meet the danger of this slope towards inequality, which I stress once again is something that is carried by various vicious spirals. A causes B, B causes A, and it goes down. We have to reverse that, and that's one of the really big problems that faces us. Okay, let me stop there because I've gone on for too long, and I'll hear your questions. Thank you very much.
My name is George Cooper, and I'm the president for the time being of the University of King's College. I suppose, this being a classicist place, you could call me Prices pro tempore or some such thing. Is it working? I know I'm not. Is this working? Hello? Anybody? Is anybody home? Why don't I just speak like this and then everybody can hear? We've just been treated to a wonderful, wonderful talk by Canada's, and I'm going to say it right out loud, leading philosopher and public intellectual. The talk on democracy makes me want to rush home immediately and see who won, whether it's the robber barons or Robin Hood. I'm not sure which. I first came to know of Charles Taylor in 1986, and the circumstances were a little bit extraordinary, as you'll find out in a moment when I tell you. I went to Moscow, and we landed at Sheremetyevo Airport at about 8 o'clock in the evening in mid-June. And of course, northern Russia, the sun was still up. So we immediately went, my friend and I, to the hotel in downtown Moscow, in the Arbat district, where the law faculty and the philosophy faculty are located. And this was towards the beginning of Glasnost. Things were opening up. People were talking openly on the streets about various ideas. And these young kids, 20, 21, 22, faces just like yours, came rushing up to us and saying, "Where are you from?" Things like that. And within minutes, they were saying, after we explained that we were from Canada, "Do you know George Grant?" Well, of course I knew George Grant. I was at the University of King's College, where George Grant was a professor at the time, and I had had lunch with George Grant only the week before. "Do you know Charles Taylor?" "No, I don't know Charles Taylor." Well, they were quite dissatisfied with that answer. Because they knew, as I sadly did not, that Charles Taylor was indeed one of the leading intellectuals and philosophers of my own country, and they, these 20, 21, 20-year-old students at the University of Moscow, knew more about the positions of Canadian philosophers than I, a kind of a pseudo-Kingsian intellectual, knew at that time. Now, of course, being interim president, I do know everything. Now I have even more information about Charles Taylor than I did then. I found out at the reception that Charles Taylor went to Balliol College, Oxford. Now, my studies of Balliol tell me that probably the most famous master in the history of Balliol was Benjamin Jowett in about the 1880s or thereabouts, who had a very particular take on the idea of democracy, at least in the context of colleges, universities and colleges. His famous saying was this: never apologize, never explain, never complain, just do it and let them howl. Is this the sort of democracy that you would like to see here at King's exercised as president? A Secular Age, a magnificent scholarly book by Charles Taylor, recently published, 2007, I think, makes the point that our whole way of looking at the world has changed in the last perhaps 200 years, because there are more people now who are secular than there are religious, and consequently our outlook on the world and the way we think has changed. But you know, the fact is that we're still thinking. And that is something that our little university here at King's likes to do all the time. That's really what King's is about. And to pick up on Fred's comment, I think actually we are all students, all of us here in this room and all of us with an affiliation with King's. We are all, I hope and believe, intellectually curious, as Alex was, and we've had our intellectual juices thoroughly stirred tonight. I want to say thank you so much to Fred and Elizabeth for sponsoring this lecture and the others in this series. I want to thank Nick Stark, our KSU president, and his group, who've done a wonderful job of selecting the speaker and helping to organize the meeting. I want to thank all of you for your support for King's, helping us to realize that impossible dream of being a thinking place of insatiable intellectual curiosity at all times. Thank you for coming up, and thank you most particularly, Charles Taylor, for helping us to keep our Kingsian intellectual pot at a rolling boil. Thank you so much.
To be the traffic cop tonight for the question and answer period. We have about a half an hour, and I see many of my learned colleagues in this room, but tonight is a night by the students, for the students. So if you're feeling left out, that I'm going to take student questions first, and if we have time, questions from other people, I'm sorry, but maybe I'm not. Because this is your night, and I would like to call, just questions. Call for questions from the students. Raise your hand, and if you want, there's a microphone coming. Just.
Oh, shy, I'm good.
Well, no, but other people want to hear you too. Who are you?
My name is Carlo. Hi. Okay, so my question is that in the face of what seems to be an organic process of degradation of the structures which allow for a democratic process, why should we still cling to a reformation of the structure of democracy rather than a moving away or a revolution instead of a reformation? Do I make myself clear?
Well, yeah, but I'm not quite sure. I mean, there's two senses of the question. You mean move away from the whole democratic ideal, or move to a radically different idea of what democracy could be? Because that's two kinds of revolutions, right?
To leave democracy altogether. I mean, if the structures which seem to keep it in place are degrading, it seems to be not a natural process, but an organic process of degradation due to, I don't know, population increase and
Okay, I see your
urbanization.
point. Yeah, well, I mean, I think that there are, to me, two very powerful reasons why not. Now, one is a valuable one. We may disagree about this, but I'll give you. I think this is one of the most valuable achievements of human history, that we have societies which are based on this value of equal citizenship and equal recognition. So we have to go on for great length about that. But I have one more reason to add, which I just don't think it's possible. That is, I do not think that departing from democracy would leave you with a regime with any kind of legitimacy at all. There are regimes in the world today which are not democratic, which have legitimacy because people have never tasted democracy, like the case of China, right? They may never let go, and then they always have the system of every 10 years the guys choose their successors, and they seem to be delivering the goods, and a lot of people for now are accepting that, but I'm not sure it's going to go on forever. But in a society that has actually tasted democracy, that has interiorized the sense of legitimacy of equal citizenship, you have to just use brute force. You have to have, or Putin-esque, you speak up and somehow you fall under a train. I don't know why you fell under a train, but you just do. Or, and so it just isn't going to be possible. It's possible, but the cost of tremendous repression. So these are two reasons. I wouldn't like to make the change, but I really think that if I said, let's try, it just wouldn't work. So you want to say?
Right there. Ruth, pass the. Thank you.
Where's the switch?
Hello? Sorry for that. Hi, my name's Tom. Is there any reason why in this process of renewal over democracy, or this cycle this time, why we should be particularly optimistic or pessimistic about its outcome? Is it inevitable that the renewal will happen?
No.
Or,
No.
okay, should we be pessimistic that it's less
No,
likely now?
because I mean, there are elements of hope and elements of doubt, right? And the elements of hope are that lots of people really mind about this, they care about this, turn out various movements and demonstrations about this. A lot of people, and people have taken polls of Canadians, and people come up with do we have too much inequality and is that endangering our democracy? And the majority of Canadians seem to think that. So that's the good news, right? The bad news is we may never get it together in such a way that it will have an effect. We'll have a program that will pass from here to there. And that's really worrying. So there are reasons to be optimistic and reasons to be pessimistic, but not reasons to be simply one or the other.
Way at the back. Yep. Yeah. Mike's on its way.
Take a while.
Hello? Okay. Thank you very much. It was a wonderful lecture. I want to put pressure on this idea of equality, and using the beginning of your lecture where you took a more historical approach. And it seems to me that, with the French Revolution and the revolt of the Third Estate, the people who labor, you had this whole sphere of civil society that opened up. And that the conception of what someone like Benjamin Constant was that this would, even in the face of restoration, this would simply defeat oppression. But there seems to be a way in which, into the 19th century with industrialization, that things change. You have the rise of the party. The party is a mid-19th century phenomenon, not the beginning of the 19th century. And so I guess I want to, equality in the middle class, is that the resolution of this, or is this a place in which there's some kind of uneasy reconciliation that's not stable? In fact, it would have to, this idea that the people who work have to be the people who are part of a democracy, that capitalism sheds jobs. In an era of mass unemployment, you can't actually have democracy. So there are deeper questions that simply cannot be resolved by equality or the middle class. Thanks.
No, I mean, I think that I fundamentally agree with you that it's always unstable. You see that you get to, let's say as of 1965 or just 1970, just before, we really felt very complacent about this in the West. And I guess you weren't older and older maybe in those days, but the feeling is we've really licked it, we've got the solution, it's all working very well, and then it came unstuck for a variety of reasons that I mentioned, right? And I think it's always that's always gonna happen. So it's a matter of, the famous Toynbee thing, challenge and response. It's always going to be challenges. The solution is never going to be perfect, even in its own time, and then it's going to become even less perfect when the situation changes. So you have this constant, and if you like, the solutions can become part of the problem. And you were mentioning the rise of the big parties, particularly the rise of social democratic parties. And then you get Roberto Michel saying, that these become themselves vehicles of elite rule from the top, and they need to be challenged. And of course, they eventually are challenged in the epoch that I'm talking about more recently, by all these movements, feminism and so on, which do challenge them. So and that leads to a new situation. I think that there's never a stable final home. I think we fooled ourselves about that because we think purely in terms of the constitutional structures, and we think we've got them. And a lot of our societies, we're running on the same one for the same constitutional structure, basically, for decades, even centuries, so it's fine. That kind of complacency is just absurdly ungrounded. So I think that there isn't going to be this final point when it's all tied together. I'm entirely agree, but we have no choice but to go on fighting, because there's no other, my point earlier is there's no other, if you like, normative game in town than equal citizenship.
Right here. Yep, you. Yeah, but bring it all the way down.
Okay.
Okay.
Press the button. You were talking about the idea of someone saying, is democracy, is it the only way? You were saying it's really too late, we've gone too far to go back from that, really. I'm wondering about the concept of the nation state, and if we've essentially, similar to that, gone too far with that structure so that we can't go back from that, but at the same time, you talked about global issues, so we have climate change, especially, international migration. So wondering if, those global issues, making it seem like, maybe nation states aren't the right way to deal with those, but then having these individual movements at the same time. So is the nation state a necessary part?
This is a very big question. You got your finger on a very big question. It isn't an easy answer, but my way of framing it would be, we can't, I can't live with her, I can't live with her. I mean, we can't live with the nation state, we can't live without the nation state. So, first of all, why can't we live without the nation state? Because it is the context in which democracy can become real, because there is a sense of solidarity and bonding between the people concerned, right? So that's why we can't do it. If we want to be a democratic world, we can't do that. We can't do simply with it because all these big problems that transcend the boundaries of the nation state require that we develop new kinds of structures which allow us to work together. And you see us moving towards that. I don't mean especially the UN, WTO, and so on. We're trying to move towards that, and we have to be inventive about that in various international instruments like the global one, which unfortunately we have just stabbed in the back. One of my least proud moments being engaged, and we did that. But it's in that direction that we have to go. So it has to be grounded in nation states, but with structures of collaboration that allow us to address these big world problems. And then you have interesting developments out of that, like Europe. See, in Europe, they still need the nation state. There isn't a real European public sphere. There isn't a real European sense of citizen bonding. The idea is there, but it doesn't, you can see when we get to crunch like now, that it isn't really there. So they still, the democratic life of Europe is still tied up with these different nations. But they were creeping toward some kind of supranational structure. And I think we all have to applaud that. Hopefully it works, and it's in danger now. See, it's a messy answer, right? But it's the only one.
Thanks. Here, you can just pass it over here. Omri.
Hello? Hey. So, first of all, thanks a lot for the talk. That was a really great jumping off point for a discussion, so I really appreciate that. However, in your talk, you mentioned actually that voting was the only vehicle for change. And I found that was very interesting, particularly with regards to extra-parliamentary movements. You mentioned yourself the role of the women's movement, the role of the gay movement in the 1960s, to emancipate and to give people more rights. But what about the union movement? Like the 40-hour workday, maternity leave, all of these things were fought for outside of Parliament. And so what I'm wondering is whether Parliament is actually that vehicle for change, or whether voting is that vehicle for change, or if it's actually just a reaction to the real change that's going on the ground.
Yeah. No, I mean, I obviously misspoke, or much too simple if I said it's the only vehicle for change. It's an indispensable vehicle for lasting change. Because although you have very good examples of in the union movement, you win certain maternity leave, and so on, these can all be rolled back by legislation or very much impeded by legislation, or very much helped by legislation, right? So what is going to bring about the right legislation, or the right even règlement, not regulation by the state? Well, only something that decides the personnel of the government, right? And that in the end we're left with voting. So it's a kind of indispensable cog in a broader machine. Now, obviously you're right, particularly things like the women's movement. New questions get on the agenda because there are big social movements out there that are ignoring parties and just putting them on the agenda, and that's very important. But the process can't be completed without bringing in how you elect or select people for the sovereign body and so on. It can't be just left to the side. That's why I felt very depressed in a way, felt very elated by Occupy, and I felt sort of let down when people replied when they were asked, we're not interested in the vote. These are very important to put things on the agenda, but they're not going to get through without it. That's what I'm saying. Indispensable, not the only.
Hand it way back there, yes. Way back.
Anybody got a football tennis?
Hi. You mentioned exclusionism as a problem. Do you see a problem with the opposite of exclusionism as well, a radical tolerance, where open-mindedism becomes empty in a sense? Is there a problem with the other side of that?
Yeah. I mean, I don't think tolerance is better than intolerance. But I don't think tolerance is the answer, because the very logic of the notion of tolerance is, you're kind of a problem for me, but I'll tolerate you, right? And whereas the problem of inclusion is something really different. The problem of inclusion is creating a common understanding of what citizenship and equal citizenship is, in which there's a place for everyone. So you need to redefine what the nation is about. You need to redefine. I mean, I'm speaking right out of our situation. That's why, to me, it's very, very evident that we have different views of what qu'est-ce qu'un Québécois. Si c'est un Québécois de souche, that's what the base of the nation is. Then other people aren't. So it's not, well, we're going to we'll be nice to them. We're going to be told that. No, let's redefine what it is to be la nation québécoise. And that is a whole lot, and then what comes into there is our understanding of our history, what's happened to us, of where we're going. Narrative comes into that. Narrative from the past into the future. We're fighting about narratives all the time. And that's the direction we're going.
Yeah. Pass it 2 doors down.
Hi. So we've sort of talked a little bit about, a lot about social movements tonight, and I'm really wondering if social movements of the recent past and the present, like Occupy, anti-pipeline movements in Canada, etc., do you think those are setting us up for democratic renewal? And if they're not, what should we be doing differently so that they are?
Are they saying, I mean, I think that all these movements have been very indispensable because they've shown deep dissatisfaction, they put these things on the agenda. But now it needs to be translated into programs of actual change that can be legislated or changed by government. And we need to connect the two. That is, connect this energy of these movements, getting them behind these programs. And as a matter of fact, a successful single issue movement itself always does that. I mean, there are these demands made, you whip up the demands and get people behind them, and then parliaments are forced to respond. Or as a matter of fact, there's also courts, there are also Supreme Courts which make big changes, and they have in the Canadian case, and they've been made changes because of that's the point for you again, because of the change in climate of opinion that's produced by these movements. But it has to connect. There's connecting with the judiciary, not connecting with the parliament, connecting with the government. It has to connect with the way in which fundamental decisions are made. And so making that connection is the whole point. I know this is very general. If we want to talk about Canada, we can get very specific, but I think we might offend. I mean, I'm sure this is a multi-party gathering, so I don't want to intrude, but I have a political preference.
Stand up.
Okay, way back there, yes.
Oh, I got the button, okay. So just a quick question, hopefully. I'm very curious about what you see in this process of renewing democracy again and again and again. What you see as the best case of the role of the public intellectual, as a public intellectual, in democracy, in the best sense of democracy.
Just sort of all sorts of roles. I mean, the role kind of gets created for you if you're interested in being a public intellectual. That something arises and you can make an intervention on it because people are willing to put you on the radio or television, or a premier names you to a commission, or there's not a single royal role, but you have to feel you have something to say and you have to really want to say it, and then the occasions will create themselves. You have to seize them. But there isn't a single way of doing it, or particularly if you're looking across different societies. I think Quebec has a very different culture in relation to public intellectuals, even in the rest of Canada. And why is that? It'll take me a long time to explain that. But so it's a different task there than it is maybe here, is in Toronto, let alone the United States. So I know a very unsatisfactory answer, but it's.
I'm told this is the last question, so I see a hand up there.
Hello. Hello. Hi. I'm just wondering if you think with the present state of non-national forms of alternative alternative ideas of democracy or of politics, such as with Occupy, which cross national borders. We saw Occupy in Canada as well as America and all over the world. If you think that that's speaking towards a sense of international or the global community responding to a renewal of democracy in a new way, like if the 21st century can see a distinctly more unilateral renewal. Is that something you've considered? Or?
Yeah, I think that's very, very, very important, because I think that you can see, well, there's two kinds of things. There are ways in which certain methods of operating catch on and get applied to quite new situations. I mean, look at the following set of stages. You get Gandhi's nonviolent resistance to colonialism. You get Martin Luther King built on Gandhi. Then you've got various of these, in Manila you get the movement against narcos. These are very interesting, non-violent mass movements, destabilizing very brutal regimes. Then you get a set of velvet revolutions, and you get, right? This has become part of the modern vernacular, as a way of proceeding that you can adapt, make sense in your own situation, because we're a single world in the ideal system. Then you get a more intense version of this with something like the Occupy movements, where it's not just 10 years later, so many years later, but there's an immediate echo elsewhere. And I think that we all recognize that there's such a thing as, if you like, cross-national opinion. I won't say world opinion exactly, but transnational movements of opinion. Transnational movements of civil society, NGOs and so on, who operate outside particular, in and well as outside particular national boundaries. And that's a very important part of the whole checkerboard. I mean, in a sense, that's part of the maybe optimistic answer to your question, right? That because, although we're in each our national situation, because there's an intense sense of sympathy and common plight very often between different societies, we can move together from different societies to produce these international instruments. I think that point is a very, very important fact of our work, that's one of the encouraging things. Who was asking you about optimism or pessimism? That's one of the optimism creating factors.
I hate to interrupt this conversation, but our time is finished, and I hope this stimulates debate. I would like to thank Elizabeth and Fred and Catherine for for our students for picking you, Dr. Taylor, and please continue the conversation in the halls, in your lives, in your rooms. Thank you very much for coming.